Om Tat Sat. Welcome to Gyan Bhakti channel from Swami Nikhilananda. My humble prostrations to the all-pervading Brahman, to my worshipful Guruji, Swami Jyotirmayanandaji Maharaj, to Ram Parivar and all sages and saints, and to each of you divine soul watching today's satsang. We are currently covering Mysticism of Ramayana. Commentary is by my Guruji, Swami Jyotirmayanandaji Maharaj, narrated by myself, Swami Nikhilananda. So yesterday we had covered Daksha Yagya and Sati's annihilation and consuming herself in the fire, and Lord Shiva giving life back to Daksha by placing a goat's head on his body and also forgiving him. So this colorful story about the events associated with Daksha's sacrificial festivity has profound mystical implications for an aspirant. Daksha, the father of Sati, represents the ego principle, and Daksha Yagya represents the realm of Sakamya karma. Sakamya means when we expect a result or action performed with desire. In this realm, people sacrifice to all gods except Shiva, like Daksh did. He invited all the other glorious gods, not Shiva. They work for wealth, for material success, for fame, things that are going to pass away, but they do not work for realizing the absolute self, which is Shiva, who can give mukti. But we are going after and that's what many of us do in this worldly plane. We are always asking for material things, for possessions, for name, for fame, for things, rather than becoming holy and using this human body to spiritualize our daily life. And that is what the deeper meaning is. So, everything is done for the sake of ego rather than the sake of the self. So he didn't like Shiva, he didn't invite him because his ego came in the way. Gods are honored because they are the fulfillers of desires, but the one who makes all desires vanish is not honored. Thus Shiva is ignored by the Daksha. But yet on the path of liberation, we have to become desireless. We need nothing from this world, because all the world will eventually give us is death. We will eventually turn into dust, nothing. We come with nothing, we go with nothing, and we all know this intellectually. I'm not saying anything new, but we then tend to get so mesmerized by Maya. Maya is the illusion power of Mother Nature, that we think we are here permanently, and that therein lies the problem, and most people getting trapped by the worldly process. So Sakamya karma also implies that one does good deeds with the desire of attaining a heavenly reward. Many times, and that's actually, there are a lot of mantras in the Vedas that actually do give you heaven if you perform them properly. But it's still for a reward that people are doing those things. A much higher aspiration would be to have nishkamya karma, or to forever unite with God. Those who perform actions with this end in mind forget that when you have exhausted the karma that afforded you heavenly enjoyments, you have to incarnate again. So people who go to heaven come back. That is Bhagavad Gita. All the essential scriptures say the same thing. For the most part, this whole world with all its activities is a Daksha Yagya. Due to delusion of intellect, the vast majority of people do not see anything wrong in living and dying in the pursuits of their perishable goals. Therefore, they continue to incarnate again and again, rather than striving to break the cycles of birth and death by attaining mukti or liberation. Sati represents the relative intellect, which enables a person to become learned or intelligent from a worldly point of view. Even though that intellect helps one to know all types of things about the world, it cannot enable a person to know the self, because it is the daughter of Daksha, or the ego. Daksha expects that his daughter Sati will always obey him, just as the ego sense in an ordinary person expects to see itself obeyed by the limited intellect. However, on the spiritual path, the intellect eventually turns away from the father ego and pursues Shiva, the absolute, a process which frustrates the ego terribly. So when Sati started supporting Shiva and not Daksha, Daksha did not like it because he's the ego principle. Just like when our ego flares up, we make up all sorts of things. Our pride swells up and we make enemies out of friends sometimes. So Sati's determination to go to her friend's house uninvited is symbolic of the intensifying confrontation between the relative intellect and the ego. The intellect, which previously had cared only about I-ness and mine-ness, now starts to question the things that it has always taken for granted. It tries to evaluate the ego itself, something which it had never done before, it never realized. But once pushed into the corner, the intellect, in this case Sati, is forced to think about the implications of the ego, in this case Daksha. In the majority of people, intellect is constantly operating under the influence of the ego principle, and it does not question the ego. The intellect simply is meek and obeys it. The moment an aspirant begins to inquire into who am I? Who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? What would I do? Will I be ready? What will I tell God when I complete my journey? Etc. When we ask these questions, who am I? We have initiated a confrontation with the ego, because the ego wants you to be involved in the worldly process, whereas the intellect is asking deeper, more difficult questions. I hope that's making sense to you, how deep these things are, the mystical meanings. These are the nuggets, the real essence of Ramayana that Guruji is so lovingly explaining to each one of us. I hope we can take some of these nuggets and apply them in our daily lives. We then realize that the ego that has been held with such great respect is not really so adorable. Rather, it is insulting for an aspirant to feel that he is glued to the ego and he will live and die whirling in the wheel of karma. Because that's what will happen. We will just pass away, and we have passed away numerous embodiments prior to this one. So this is the time for us to introspect, think deeper, and try to change our lives. Thus the intellect enters into the hall of ego and recognizes that all the grandiose things that the ego has done are defective, because the most important thing in life is lacking. What is that? Shiva, the recognition of the absolute self. The ego doesn't want Shiva. With this realization, the intellect plunges itself into a process of intuitive transformation, allowing itself to be burnt up in the fire of samadhi. That is the real essence and the meaning of Sati's transformation, or super consciousness state, which brings about a profound change in our mind and causes the individual to emerge as a transformed personality. This is what we had started initially when we talked about sage Valmiki, how he was a highway robber and how he transformed into such a wonderful, enlightened sage. As the intellect confronts the ego, it is assisted by the attendants of Shiva, the forces of dispassion and discrimination. That's who the Shiv Ganas are. With the help of these forces, all illusions of the mind, which go to form the sacrificial hall of Daksha, begin to break, and all egoistic values are overhauled. Veerbhadra, the chief attendant of Lord Shiva, he represents Paravairagya, or supreme dispassion. He brings about the highest form of samadhi and destroys whatever has not already been destroyed by the other attendants. So the Puranic story about Shiva reviving Daksha by giving him a head of a goat is a mystical satire about egoistic consciousness. The endless assertions of the ego are an insult to Shiva, and eventually he strikes down the ego with his trident. In a state of surrender and humility, the ego begins to bleat like a goat, and then Shiva becomes immensely pleased. So the ego is sublimated. That is the essence of this satsanga. We will be covering more in tomorrow's satsang. This is Swami Nikhilanand. Om Tat Sat.